The conference room smelled like stale coffee and the kind of artificial vanilla air freshener that made everything feel cheap. Diana Chen sat perfectly still in the hard plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching her manager's lips move, but hearing something entirely different than what was being said. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Insubordination, Victoria Hartwell repeated, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. Repeated failure to follow direct orders, undermining company protocol. Each word was delivered with the precision of someone who had practiced this speech in the mirror. Effective immediately, your employment with Morrison Associates is terminated. The HR representative, a nervous woman with wire-rimmed glasses, slid a manila folder across the table. Severance papers, non-disclosure agreement, the corporate equivalent of a burial shroud. Diana stared at the documents, but didn't reach for them. Not yet, because somewhere in the back of her mind, behind the shock and the crushing weight of public humiliation, a small voice was whispering something Victoria Hartwell didn't expect her to remember. 3 weeks ago, late Thursday evening, the office mostly empty, except for the cleaning crew and the soft hum of computers left running overnight. Diana had forgotten her laptop charger and returned to retrieve it from her desk. That's when she heard Victoria's voice drifting from the executive conference room, sharp and urgent, talking to someone on speakerphone about client account transfers that didn't match any authorization Diana had ever processed. Victoria continued talking, her voice growing more confident with each passing second. Diana has demonstrated a consistent pattern of disrespecting authority and questioning legitimate business decisions. This creates a toxic work environment that we simply cannot tolerate. The irony wasn't lost on Diana. The woman sitting across from her, speaking about respect and legitimacy, had spent the last 6 months systematically undermining every project Diana touched. But Victoria didn't know that Diana had started keeping records. Detailed, time-stamped, meticulously organized records of every meeting, every email, every suspicious transaction that crossed her desk. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. Diana arrived at Morrison Associates at 7:30, the same time she'd been arriving for the past 3 years. The 30-story glass building in downtown Seattle caught the early morning light like a prism, casting rainbow reflections across the concrete plaza below. She'd always found something beautiful about that building in the morning hours, before the weight of the day settled in and transformed it into just another corporate tower filled with people trying to survive until 5 o'clock. Diana had built her reputation at Morrison Associates one client at a time. As a senior financial analyst, she specialized in portfolio management for high-net-worth individuals, the kind of clients who trusted the firm with generational wealth and expected nothing less than perfection. Her desk was positioned in the northwest corner of the 23rd floor, with a view of Elliott Bay that she'd earned through 3 years of 60-hour weeks and weekend client calls. The coffee in the break room was always terrible, but Diana had learned to drink it anyway. Corporate survival meant adapting to small indignities, and she'd mastered the art of finding comfort in routine. Black coffee, no sugar, in the blue ceramic mug her colleague Marcus had given her last Christmas. She was stirring the bitter liquid when Victoria appeared in the doorway. "Diana, conference room, now." No good morning, no explanation, just the kind of curt command that Victoria had perfected since her promotion to regional director 8 months ago. Diana had watched Victoria climb the corporate ladder with a combination of admiration and unease. There was something too polished about Victoria's ascent, too smooth and calculated, like she'd studied the game from the outside and learned to play it better than people who'd grown up in it. Diana followed Victoria down the carpeted hallway, past the framed awards and corporate mission statements that lined the walls like monuments to productivity. The conference room door closed with a soft click, and that's when Diana noticed the HR representative already seated at the table, her expression carefully neutral. "Please sit," Victoria said, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a request. Diana lowered herself into the chair, her mind racing through possibilities. A promotion, maybe? A new client assignment? A restructuring announcement? The last thing she expected was the word that came next: insubordination. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Diana blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Victoria opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a sheet of paper. "Over the past several months, you've repeatedly questioned my directives, challenged established protocols, and created tension within the team. Most recently, you've been asking inappropriate questions about client account management that fall outside your purview." Each word felt like a physical blow. Diana's throat tightened, and she found herself struggling to form a coherent response. "Victoria, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've never questioned your authority. If anything, I've been trying to ensure we're following proper compliance procedures." "Exactly." Victoria's voice cut through Diana's explanation like a blade. "You've been overstepping boundaries, inserting yourself into matters that don't concern you, and frankly, creating a hostile work environment for other team members." The hostile work environment accusation was particularly cruel because Diana knew exactly where it came from. 3 weeks ago, during a team meeting, she'd raised concerns about irregularities in the Pemberton account. The client's investment portfolio showed transfers that didn't align with their stated risk tolerance or investment objectives. When Diana brought this to Victoria's attention, she was told to focus on her own assignments and stop micromanaging other people's work. But Diana couldn't stop thinking about those transfers. The Pemberton account wasn't just any client file. It was a 90-year-old widow whose late husband had entrusted Morrison Associates with managing the foundation that funded scholarships for underprivileged students. Every dollar that went missing from that account was a scholarship that wouldn't be awarded, a student whose dreams would be deferred for reasons they'd never understand. "I was trying to protect our clients," Diana said, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "Your definition of protection isn't aligned with company standards."
"This decision is final." The HR representative cleared her throat. "Diana, you'll need to clean out your desk today. Security will escort you from the building. Your final paycheck and severance information are in this packet." She gestured toward the manila folder that still sat untouched on the table. Diana stared at the folder, her mind reeling. 3 years of her life reduced to a manila envelope? 3 years of early mornings and late nights, of client presentations and compliance reviews, of building relationships and earning trust. All of it erased with a single conversation in a conference room that smelled like artificial vanilla. But as the shock began to wear off, something else took its place. Not anger exactly, though that would come later. Not sadness, though she felt that too. What Diana felt in that moment was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when all the pieces of a puzzle suddenly snap into place, and you realize you've been looking at the picture wrong the entire time. Victoria wasn't firing her for insubordination. Victoria was firing her because she'd gotten too close to something Victoria didn't want her to see. Diana reached across the table and picked up the manila folder. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, then looked directly at Victoria. "I'll need some time to process this information and review the documents with my attorney." Victoria's carefully composed expression flickered for just a second. "That's your right, of course, but the termination is effective immediately." "I understand," Diana said, standing up from the table. "I'll be in touch." She walked out of the conference room with her head high, the manila folder tucked under her arm like armor. Behind her, she could hear Victoria and the HR representative speaking in low voices, but she didn't turn around. There would be time to process their words later. Right now, she needed to get to her desk and retrieve something far more valuable than her personal belongings. Diana's workspace had always been meticulously organized. Her computer files were sorted into clearly labeled folders, her physical documents were arranged chronologically in color-coded binders, and her desk drawers contained everything from spare phone chargers to emergency granola bars. But hidden within this apparent order was something Victoria didn't know about. A system within the system, carefully designed to document every irregularity Diana had noticed over the past 6 months. She had learned early in her career that memory was unreliable, especially when it came to financial details. So she developed the habit of keeping detailed notes about everything. Client conversations, meeting outcomes, unusual transactions, policy changes that didn't make sense. What had started as a professional best practice had evolved into something more deliberate after Victoria's promotion, when the culture of the office began to shift in ways that made Diana uncomfortable. The security guard assigned to escort her was a kind man named Robert, who'd worked in the building for over a decade. He stood at a respectful distance while Diana gathered her belongings, occasionally glancing at his watch but never rushing her. She packed her personal items quickly: the framed photo of her parents, the small succulent plant she'd been keeping alive for 2 years, the collection of pens she'd accumulated from various conferences and client meetings. But the real prize was hidden in plain sight. Tucked between her daily planners and reference materials was a thin black notebook that looked like dozens of others scattered around the office. Diana slipped it into her purse without fanfare, along with a USB drive that had been camouflaged as a promotional keychain from a financial services conference. "Take your time," Robert said gently, but Diana could see other employees beginning to gather in the nearby cubicles, drawn by the unmistakable drama of a colleague being escorted out. She finished packing her cardboard box and followed Robert to the elevator. As the doors closed, Diana caught a glimpse of Victoria standing in her office doorway, watching the proceedings with an expression that looked less like relief and more like concern. The elevator descended in silence. Diana watched the floor numbers tick down: 23, 22, 21, each one marking another step away from the life she'd built and towards something unknown. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel the crushing weight of uncertainty. Instead, she felt the dangerous calm that comes with having a plan. Diana's apartment was a one-bedroom unit in Capitol Hill, close enough to downtown that she could walk to work when the weather was nice, far enough away that she could afford it on a single income. She'd moved there right after college, intending it to be temporary, but something about the neighborhood's quirky energy and the view of the Space Needle from her kitchen window had convinced her to stay. She set the cardboard box on her kitchen counter and made herself a proper cup of coffee, the kind that required grinding beans and measuring water and waiting for the ritual to work its small magic. Only then did she retrieve the black notebook from her purse and spread its contents across her dining table. 6 months of documentation. Every suspicious transaction she'd noticed, every client account that showed unexplained activity, every meeting where Victoria had deflected questions or changed the subject when compliance issues arose. Diana had organized the information chronologically, with cross-references and supporting documentation carefully noted. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Small transfers from multiple client accounts, usually amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic compliance reviews. Funds moved to temporary holding accounts before being redistributed in ways that didn't match the client's stated investment objectives. Authorization signatures that looked legitimate but hadn't been properly witnessed or documented according to firm policy. Diana opened her laptop and inserted the USB drive. The files she'd saved were copies of everything: client correspondence, internal memos, transaction records that she'd accessed through her normal work responsibilities but had thought to preserve when things started feeling wrong. She'd been careful to only document information she had legitimate access to, nothing that would constitute industrial espionage or violate client confidentiality agreements. But what she'd found was enough to make her hands shake as she read through the evidence. Victoria had been stealing from clients. Not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately raise red flags, but systematically and carefully, skimming small amounts from large accounts and hiding the theft through a complex web of legitimate-looking transactions. The Pemberton account was just one example. Over the past 4 months, nearly $50,000 had been diverted from the foundation's investment portfolio into accounts that Diana couldn't trace through normal firm records. The scope of the theft was staggering. At least 8 client accounts showed similar irregularities, representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in missing funds. Money that belonged to retirees, foundations, families who had trusted Morrison Associates with their financial security. Diana closed the laptop and walked to her kitchen window. The Seattle skyline stretched out before her, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between the buildings. Somewhere in one of those towers, Victoria was probably celebrating the successful removal of a threat to her operation. She might even be planning her next move, confident that the problem had been eliminated. But Victoria had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that firing Diana would silence her, that the threat of legal retaliation and the stigma of termination would be enough to keep her quiet. What Victoria didn't understand was that Diana had never been motivated by job security or corporate advancement. She'd been motivated by something simpler and more dangerous, the belief that people should be able to trust the institutions they relied on. Diana returned to her dining table and opened the notebook to a fresh page.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
At the top, she wrote a single word: plan. The first step was obvious. She needed to report the theft to the appropriate authorities. But Diana had worked in finance long enough to know that whistleblowing was a complicated process, especially when it involved allegations against someone in a position of authority. She would need to be strategic, methodical, and, above all, she would need to document everything. The second step was more personal. Victoria had tried to destroy Diana's reputation with accusations of insubordination and hostile behavior. The narrative Victoria was building painted Diana as a disgruntled employee who couldn't accept authority, someone whose claims should be dismissed as revenge fantasy rather than legitimate concerns. Diana needed to control her own story. She spent the rest of the evening organizing her evidence into a comprehensive file. Each allegation was supported by multiple documents, cross-referenced with firm policies and federal regulations, and presented in language that was clear and professional. She created timelines, summaries, and visual aids that would help investigators understand the scope and sophistication of Victoria's scheme. But as she worked, Diana couldn't shake the memory of that moment in the conference room when Victoria had looked directly at her and delivered the word insubordination with such practiced confidence. There had been something rehearsed about the entire proceeding, as if Victoria had been planning Diana's termination for weeks and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. The realization hit Diana like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't fired her because of the questions about the Pemberton account. Victoria had fired her because she'd somehow discovered that Diana was documenting irregularities. But how? Diana's mind raced through possibilities. Her computer access, maybe, her email communications, the questions she'd asked other colleagues. Somewhere along the way, she'd tipped her hand, and Victoria had responded by eliminating the threat before it could fully develop. Which meant Victoria knew that Diana had evidence, which meant Victoria would be taking steps to protect herself. Diana grabbed her phone and started scrolling through her contacts. She needed legal advice, and she needed it tonight. But more than that, she needed to understand exactly what kind of opponent she was facing. Victoria Hartwell wasn't just a thief, she was a sophisticated criminal who had successfully infiltrated a prestigious financial firm and operated undetected for months. Someone like that didn't leave loose ends. The call went to voicemail. Diana left a brief message asking her attorney to call her back as soon as possible, then hung up and stared at her dining table covered with evidence of corporate fraud. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of seeking justice for the clients who had been robbed. Tomorrow, she would start fighting to clear her own name and expose the truth about Victoria Hartwell. But tonight, she needed to prepare for war. Diana had never thought of herself as particularly brave. Growing up, she'd been the careful one, the rule follower, the daughter who studied hard and made safe choices, and built a life that looked exactly like what everyone expected from a responsible adult. Even her decision to pursue a career in finance had been motivated more by stability than passion. Numbers made sense to her, and financial analysis provided the kind of clear, logical framework that felt comforting in an uncertain world. But sitting in her apartment with evidence of Victoria's crimes spread across her table, Diana discovered something about herself that she'd never known. When faced with injustice, when confronted with someone who abused their power to harm innocent people, she wasn't capable of staying silent, not even when silence would be safer. She spent the next several hours creating backup copies of everything. Digital files were uploaded to multiple cloud storage services. Physical documents were photocopied and stored in different locations. She drafted detailed summaries of her findings and saved them in password-protected files that she could access from any computer. By midnight, Diana had transformed her dining room into a command center for exposing corporate fraud. She had evidence, she had a plan, and most importantly, she had something Victoria Hartwell had clearly underestimated: the quiet determination of someone who had been underestimated her entire life. The next morning, Diana woke before dawn with a clarity of purpose that felt almost foreign. For months, she'd been operating under the assumption that something was wrong but hadn't been able to identify exactly what. The uncertainty had been exhausting, like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. But now, all the pieces were on the table, and the picture they formed was unmistakable. Victoria Hartwell was a criminal who had used her position of trust to steal from vulnerable clients. She had covered her tracks by creating a hostile work environment for anyone who asked too many questions, and when that wasn't enough, she'd resorted to character assassination and wrongful termination. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that Diana would be intimidated by the firing, that the threat to her professional reputation would be enough to ensure her silence. What Victoria didn't understand was that Diana's professional reputation was based on something more fundamental than employment status. It was based on integrity, on the belief that financial professionals had a responsibility to protect their clients from exactly the kind of predatory behavior Victoria was engaged in. Diana dressed carefully for her first appointment of the day, a meeting with a whistleblower attorney whose name she'd found through online research. She chose a navy blue suit, conservative jewelry, and minimal makeup. The goal was to project competence and credibility, to look like exactly what she was, a serious professional with legitimate concerns about criminal activity. The attorney's office was in a glass tower not far from Morrison Associates, close enough that Diana could see her former workplace from the waiting room window. She found herself staring at the building where she'd spent 3 years of her life, wondering how many other employees had noticed irregularities but had been too afraid to speak up. How many other people had been silenced by Victoria's manipulation and intimidation? When the attorney called her into his office, Diana was ready. She presented her evidence methodically, explaining each document and transaction with the kind of precise attention to detail that had made her valuable as a financial analyst. The attorney, a soft-spoken man named Chen who specialized in financial crimes, listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Diana to tell her story in her own words. "This is substantial," he said when she finished. "The documentation is thorough, the pattern is clear, and the amounts involved are significant enough to warrant serious criminal charges. But I need to ask you a difficult question." Diana braced herself. "Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once we file these allegations, your former employer is going to do everything in their power to discredit you. They'll argue that you're a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. They'll scrutinize every aspect of your professional history and personal life. This isn't going to be easy." Diana thought about the manila folder sitting on her kitchen counter, about Victoria's practiced speech about insubordination, about the clients whose money had been stolen while they trusted Morrison Associates to protect their financial security. "I'm prepared," she said. What Diana wasn't prepared for was how quickly things would escalate once the investigation began. Within a week of filing her complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, she received a cease and desist letter from Morrison Associates' legal team threatening legal action if she continued to make false and defamatory statements about the firm and its employees.
The letter was signed by the same law firm that had handled her termination paperwork, and the language was designed to intimidate. They accused Diana of violating her non-disclosure agreement, of making unfounded allegations to damage the firm's reputation, and of engaging in a pattern of harassment against Victoria Hartwell. Diana read the letter twice, then forwarded it to Chen with a brief note, "They're scared." But even as she tried to project confidence, Diana felt the weight of isolation settling around her like fog. Her former colleagues weren't returning her calls. Her LinkedIn connections were suddenly quiet. The professional network she'd spent 3 years building seemed to have evaporated overnight, leaving her to wonder how many people genuinely believed she was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. The financial pressure was immediate and crushing. Diana's severance package included 3 months of salary, but it came with strings attached, specifically a non-disclosure agreement that she'd refused to sign. Without that signature, Morrison Associates was under no obligation to provide any severance at all. Diana found herself facing unemployment with no income and mounting legal expenses. She took a part-time job at a small accounting firm, work that paid a fraction of her previous salary but kept her busy and provided health insurance. The owner was a woman named Sarah Martinez, who had started her own practice after leaving a large firm under circumstances that she described as philosophical differences with management. Sarah didn't ask too many questions about Diana's situation, but she made it clear that Diana was welcome to stay as long as she needed. Sometimes, doing the right thing costs more than we expect, Sarah said one afternoon as they worked late on a client's tax returns. But the cost of not doing it is always higher. Diana was beginning to understand exactly what Sarah meant. The investigation was moving slowly, hampered by Morrison Associates' legal team and the complexity of tracing financial transactions across multiple accounts and time periods. Meanwhile, Victoria continued to work in her position of authority, with access to client accounts and the ability to cover her tracks or destroy evidence. But Diana had one advantage that Victoria didn't know about. She wasn't working alone anymore. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Williams, Diana's former colleague who had given her the blue ceramic coffee mug, reached out through an encrypted messaging app that Diana had barely known existed. "I need to talk to you," his message read, "but not over normal channels. Can you meet me somewhere private?" They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Fremont, far from the financial district and the network of professional relationships that connected everyone in Seattle's finance community. Marcus arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. When Diana joined him, she was struck by how tired he looked, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. "I heard about what happened," he said without preamble. "The official story, I mean. Insubordination, creating a hostile work environment, all of that." Diana nodded, unsure how much she should reveal. Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I also heard about the SEC investigation." Diana's blood ran cold. The investigation was supposed to be confidential at this stage. If Marcus knew about it, then Victoria almost certainly knew as well. "How did you—" "Victoria called a team meeting yesterday," Marcus interrupted. "She said there was a disgruntled former employee making false allegations against the firm. She said we might be contacted by investigators and that we should refer all inquiries to the legal department. She was very specific about not discussing client accounts or internal procedures with anyone outside the firm." Diana processed this information slowly. Victoria was already working to control the narrative, to frame any investigation as harassment by a vengeful former employee rather than legitimate inquiry into criminal activity. "But here's the thing," Marcus continued. "After that meeting, I started thinking about some of the questions you'd been asking, about the Pemberton account specifically. So I pulled the files." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thin manila folder. "I made copies before I lost my nerve, because what I found— Diana, you were right. The transactions don't make sense. Money is definitely going missing." Diana's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the folder. Inside were account statements and transaction records that corroborated everything she documented, but from a different angle. Marcus had access to internal authorization codes and approval signatures that Diana had never seen. "There's more," Marcus said. "I'm not the only one who's been asking questions. Jennifer in compliance has been trying to reconcile some discrepancies for weeks. Tom in client services has gotten complaints from 2 different families about portfolio performance that doesn't match their statements. And yesterday, I overheard Victoria on a phone call with someone about transferring funds to offshore accounts." The scope of the conspiracy was larger than Diana had imagined. Victoria wasn't just stealing from individual clients. She was operating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that involved multiple accounts and potentially multiple accomplices. And now she was trying to cover her tracks by discrediting anyone who might expose her. "Why are you telling me this?" Diana asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Because my grandmother was one of our clients," he said finally. "She passed away last year, and when we were settling her estate, we found some irregularities in her investment account. Small amounts, nothing that seemed worth pursuing legally, but enough to make us wonder. I always assumed it was just confusion about fees or market fluctuations, but now—" He looked up at Diana, and she could see the guilt in his eyes. "Now, I think someone stole from my grandmother. And if that's true, then they're stealing from other people's grandmothers too, and I can't live with that." Diana reached across the table and touched his hand. "It's not too late to do something about it."
What happened next would determine whether justice was possible or whether Victoria Hartwell would successfully destroy the lives of everyone who threatened her operation. But for the first time since walking out of Morrison Associates with a cardboard box of personal belongings, Diana felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The evidence was mounting, the investigation was expanding, and Victoria's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. The question was whether it would crack quickly enough to save the clients whose money was still being stolen, and whether Diana could survive the professional and personal destruction that Victoria was undoubtedly planning. But as Diana sat in that small cafe in Fremont, surrounded by the evidence of Victoria's crimes and supported by colleagues who had found the courage to speak truth to power, she realized something important. She wasn't the same person who had been fired for insubordination 2 weeks ago. That woman had been careful, rule-following, afraid to make waves. This woman was someone entirely different. This woman was dangerous. And Victoria Hartwell was about to find out exactly how dangerous a financial analyst could be when she decided to stop being polite and start being precise. The encrypted messaging app that Marcus had introduced Diana to became their primary means of communication over the following weeks. It felt absurd, like they were conducting corporate espionage rather than trying to protect elderly clients from theft. But the precautions proved necessary when Diana discovered that Victoria had somehow gained access to her personal email account. The discovery came by accident. Diana was checking her sent folder for a copy of an email she'd forwarded to David Chen when she noticed a message she hadn't written. It was addressed to someone named Kevin Morrison, and the subject line read, "Concerns about former employee allegations." The email was brief but devastating, written in Diana's voice and expressing doubts about her own accusations against Victoria. It suggested that Diana had been suffering from stress-related mental health issues and might have misinterpreted legitimate business transactions. Diana stared at the screen in disbelief. The email had been sent 3 days ago, during business hours, when Diana had been working at Sarah Martinez's accounting firm. Someone had accessed her account remotely and composed a message designed to undermine her credibility with the very people who were investigating her allegations. She immediately changed all her passwords and enabled two-factor authentication on every account she could think of. Then she called David Chen. "This is escalation," he said after Diana forwarded him the fabricated email. "Whoever we're dealing with has resources and technical sophistication beyond what I'd expect from a simple embezzlement scheme. They're actively trying to sabotage your credibility, which suggests they view you as a serious threat." "Is that good or bad?" Diana asked. "Both," David replied. "Good because it means our investigation is getting close to something important. Bad because it means they're willing to commit additional crimes to protect themselves. Email fraud, identity theft, defamation, these are serious felonies that carry significant prison time." Diana felt a chill run down her spine. She'd known that exposing Victoria would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated this level of sophisticated retaliation. Victoria wasn't just covering her tracks, she was actively trying to destroy Diana's reputation and mental stability. The next morning, Diana received a call from her former landlord. Apparently, someone had contacted him claiming to be a reference checker for a potential employer, asking about Diana's reliability as a tenant. The caller had implied that Diana was under investigation for financial crimes and suggested that the landlord might want to reconsider her lease renewal. "I don't know what kind of trouble you're in," the landlord said, "but I've never had any problems with you. Someone's spreading lies, and I thought you should know." Diana thanked him and hung up, her hands shaking with rage. Victoria was systematically attacking every aspect of her life, trying to isolate her socially and financially. The message was clear: drop the investigation or face complete personal destruction. But Victoria had miscalculated again. Instead of intimidating Diana, the escalating attacks only strengthened her resolve. Someone who was willing to go to these lengths to silence her was clearly guilty of something far worse than simple embezzlement. Diana met Marcus at a different location each time they needed to discuss their investigation. Today, it was the central branch of the Seattle Public Library, where they could speak quietly among the stacks without attracting attention. Marcus had brought additional documentation, and his expression was grimmer than Diana had ever seen it. "I've been doing more digging," he said, pulling out a laptop and opening an encrypted folder. "The offshore accounts I mentioned? I found them.
Or at least, I found evidence of them. He showed Diana a series of wire transfer receipts that had been carefully buried in routine transaction reports. Small amounts, never more than $10,000 at a time, being moved from client accounts to intermediary holdings and then transferred to banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The total is over $2 million, Marcus said quietly, and that's just what I can track from the past 8 months. This has probably been going on much longer. Diana felt sick. $2 million represented the life savings of dozens of families, the college funds of countless children, the retirement security of people who had worked their entire lives to build financial stability. Victoria hadn't just stolen money, she'd stolen dreams and futures and peace of mind. There's something else, Marcus continued. I think Victoria has been using the client database to target specific accounts. The victims aren't random. They're all people who are unlikely to notice small discrepancies quickly. Elderly clients with complex portfolios, trust funds managed by absentee beneficiaries, institutional accounts with multiple administrators. The sophistication of the scheme was breathtaking. Victoria had studied the client base carefully, identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical precision. She'd built a criminal enterprise that could have operated undetected for years if Diana hadn't started asking uncomfortable questions. Who else knows about this? Diana asked. Marcus hesitated. Jennifer in compliance is definitely suspicious, but she's scared to say anything official. Tom in client services has gotten more complaints, but Victoria has been handling them personally and telling clients that the discrepancies are due to market volatility. And there's something else. I think David Kim in IT might be involved. David Kim was the senior systems administrator who managed the firm's computer networks and security protocols.
If he was complicit in Victoria's scheme, it would explain how she'd gained access to Diana's email account and how the fraudulent transactions had been hidden so effectively. We need to be careful who we trust, Diana said. If Victoria has allies inside the firm, then our investigation could be compromised. They spent the next hour reviewing the evidence Marcus had gathered, cross-referencing it with Diana's original documentation, and identifying patterns that strengthened their case. By the time they left the library, they had assembled a comprehensive picture of Victoria's criminal operation that went far beyond simple embezzlement. But as Diana walked home through the evening rain, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Twice, she noticed the same black sedan following her route, and when she ducked into a coffee shop to test her suspicion, the car parked across the street and waited. Diana ordered a latte she didn't want and sat by the window, observing the sedan. The windows were tinted too darkly to see inside, but the license plate was clearly visible. She discreetly photographed it with her phone, then texted the image to David Chen. 20 minutes later, the sedan drove away. Diana waited another 30 minutes before leaving the coffee shop, taking a circuitous route home that included several stops at busy stores where she could check for surveillance. She didn't see the sedan again, but the message had been received. Victoria knew exactly where Diana was and what she was doing. That night, Diana couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to every sound in the building, jumping at footsteps in the hallway and the occasional car door slamming outside. The sophisticated nature of Victoria's operation suggested resources and connections that extended far beyond Morrison Associates. Diana found herself wondering exactly who she was fighting and whether she was equipped for the battle she'd started. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. Jennifer Walsh from Compliance called Diana directly, her voice tight with anxiety. "I need to see you," Jennifer said. "Today, somewhere private. I have information you need to hear, but I can't discuss it over the phone." They met at Green Lake, walking the perimeter trail where their conversation would be lost in the ambient noise of joggers and dog walkers. Jennifer was a methodical woman in her 50s who had worked in financial compliance for over 20 years. She rarely showed emotion at the office, but today her hands were shaking as she spoke. "I've been trying to reconcile account discrepancies for 3 months," Jennifer said. "Every time I identified a problem and brought it to Victoria's attention, she had an explanation. Market corrections, fee adjustments, client-authorized transfers. The explanations always sounded reasonable, and she had documentation to support them." They paused at a bench overlooking the lake. Families were feeding ducks in the shallows, and the normalcy of the scene felt surreal given the conversation they were having. "But last week, I decided to verify some of the documentation independently," Jennifer continued. I called clients directly to confirm transfers that were supposedly authorized by them. Diana, none of them had authorized anything. They didn't even know the transfers had occurred. The weight of Jennifer's revelation settled over Diana like a physical burden. Independent verification from a compliance professional meant that their evidence was no longer circumstantial. They had proof of unauthorized transactions and client fraud that would be difficult for any defense attorney to explain away. "How many clients did you contact?" Diana asked. 5, Jennifer replied, and all 5 confirmed that they hadn't authorized the transfers in question. We're talking about nearly $300,000 in fraudulent transactions, and that's just from the sample I tested. Diana felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Hope because Jennifer's evidence would significantly strengthen their case. Dread because it confirmed the massive scope of the theft and the number of innocent people who had been victimized. "Are you willing to testify about what you found?" Diana asked. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, watching the families at the lake's edge. "My husband thinks I should stay out of it," she said finally. "He's worried about retaliation, about me losing my job and being blacklisted in the industry. We have 2 kids in college, and we can't afford for me to be unemployed." Diana understood the fear. She was living with the same concerns about her own future and financial security. But she also knew that silence would allow Victoria to continue stealing from vulnerable clients indefinitely. "I can't make that decision for you," Diana said gently. "But I can tell you that Victoria's operation is sophisticated enough that she'll eventually be caught whether we act or not. The question is, how many more people will be victimized before that happens?" Jennifer nodded slowly. "Give me 48 hours to think about it," she said, "and to talk to my family. This is bigger than just my job. It's about whether I can live with myself if I stay quiet." They parted ways at the parking lot, and Diana drove home with mixed emotions. Jennifer's evidence was potentially game-changing, but it also highlighted how many Morrison Associates had noticed problems and chosen to remain silent rather than risk their careers. The culture of fear that Victoria had created was almost as damaging as the theft itself. She'd built an environment where good people were too afraid to do the right thing, where questioning authority was treated as insubordination rather than due diligence. Diana realized that exposing the financial crimes was only part of the solution. They also needed to address the systemic dysfunction that had allowed those crimes to flourish. That evening, Diana received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Martinez appeared at her apartment door carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of grim determination. "We need to talk," Sarah said, "and I think we both need a drink." They sat on Diana's small balcony overlooking the city, sharing the wine and the kind of conversation that only happened between people who had survived similar professional crises. Sarah had indeed left her previous firm under circumstances that she described as discovering that integrity and profitability don't always align. "I found evidence that my former partners were deliberately misrepresenting tax liabilities to corporate clients. Not illegal, exactly, but ethically questionable in ways that made me uncomfortable. When I raised concerns, I was told that I didn't understand the complexities of high-level tax strategy." Diana recognized the pattern immediately. The dismissive language, the implication that questioning unethical behavior demonstrated professional inadequacy, the gradual isolation of anyone who refused to go along with questionable practices.
"How did you handle it?" Diana asked. Sarah smiled ruefully. "I documented everything, consulted with an attorney, and filed a formal complaint with the State Ethics Board. The investigation took 18 months, and during that time, I was effectively shut out of every major accounting firm in the city. No one wanted to hire someone who had blown the whistle on their former colleagues. Do you regret it?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "The Ethics Board found violations and imposed sanctions. 3 of my former partners were disciplined, and the firm was required to implement new oversight procedures. But more importantly, I can sleep at night knowing that I didn't participate in something I knew was wrong." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains. Diana found herself thinking about legacy and integrity, about the kind of person she wanted to be when the crisis was over. "There's something else you should know," Sarah said eventually. "I've been getting calls from people asking about you, potential employers supposedly wanting references. But the questions they're asking aren't typical reference checks. They're fishing for information about your mental stability, your financial situation, your relationships." Diana's blood ran cold.
Victoria's campaign of character assassination was expanding beyond her former workplace, reaching into her new professional relationships and threatening her ability to rebuild her career. "What did you tell them?" Diana asked. "That you're one of the most ethical and competent financial professionals I've ever worked with," Sarah replied, "and that anyone suggesting otherwise is probably lying for their own reasons. But Diana, this level of coordinated harassment suggests that you're dealing with someone who has significant resources and connections. You need to be very careful." The conversation reinforced Diana's growing sense that Victoria's operation was more sophisticated than a simple embezzlement scheme. The technical capabilities, the financial resources, the apparent network of contacts who could conduct character assassination across multiple organizations, all of it suggested a criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching far beyond Morrison Associates. But it also strengthened Diana's resolve. If Victoria was willing to go to these lengths to silence her, it meant that their investigation was close to exposing something significant. The harassment wasn't just retaliation, it was desperation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David Chen called Diana at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with excitement and urgency. "The FBI wants to meet with you," he said without preamble, "today. They've been conducting their own investigation into Morrison and Associates, and your complaint provided crucial corroborating evidence for a much larger case." Diana sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "What kind of larger case?" "Money laundering," David replied. "Apparently, the offshore accounts you and Marcus identified are part of a sophisticated scheme to clean proceeds from various criminal activities. Victoria Hartwell isn't just stealing from clients, she's helping other criminals legitimize their ill-gotten gains through the firm's investment platform." The scope of the revelation was staggering. Morrison and Associates wasn't just harboring an embezzler, it was functioning as a front for organized criminal activity. The prestigious reputation of the firm, the trust of high-net-worth clients, the sophisticated financial instruments, all of it was being exploited to provide criminal organizations with access to legitimate financial markets. "How long has the FBI been investigating?" Diana asked. 18 months, David said. "They've been building a case against a network of individuals and organizations involved in various financial crimes. Your complaints about Victoria's activities provided them with an inside perspective they'd been missing, and the evidence you've gathered fills in crucial gaps in their investigation." Diana felt a mixture of validation and fear. Validation because it confirmed that her suspicions about Victoria's activities were not only correct but understated. Fear because it meant she'd been investigating people who were far more dangerous than she'd realized. The FBI meeting was scheduled for that afternoon at their Seattle field office. Diana spent the morning reviewing all her documentation and preparing for what would likely be the most important interview of her life. She called Marcus to let him know about the development, and his relief was palpable. "Thank God," he said. "I've been losing sleep worrying that we were in over our heads. If the FBI is involved, then at least we're not fighting this battle alone." But even as Diana prepared for the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria was preparing for something as well. The harassment and surveillance had been building towards some kind of confrontation, and Diana suspected that Victoria's next move would be more direct and more dangerous than anything she'd attempted so far. The FBI field office was located in a nondescript building in the International District, and Diana's escort through security and up to the interview room felt like stepping into a different world. The agents who met with her were professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about every aspect of her investigation and taking copious notes about the evidence she'd gathered. Special Agent Carol Reeves, who led the interview, was a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested extensive experience with financial crimes. She listened carefully as Diana recounted her discoveries, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly allowing Diana to tell her story without interruption. "Your documentation is extremely thorough," Agent Reeves said, "and it corroborates intelligence we've been gathering through other sources. But I need to be clear about something. The investigation we're conducting involves individuals who have demonstrated a willingness to use violence to protect their operations. Your safety and the safety of anyone helping you could be at risk." The words hit Diana like a physical blow. She'd known that Victoria was dangerous, but she'd been thinking in terms of career destruction and financial retaliation. The possibility of physical violence hadn't seriously occurred to her. "What kind of violence?" Diana asked. "Intimidation, assault, property destruction," Agent Reeves replied. "In extreme cases, we've seen attempts at serious bodily harm against witnesses and informants. I'm not trying to scare you away from cooperating with our investigation, but I want you to understand the full scope of what you might be facing." Diana thought about the black sedan that had followed her, about the sophisticated hacking of her email account, about the coordinated character assassination campaign. All of it took on a more sinister cast when viewed through the lens of organized criminal activity. "What kind of protection can you offer?"
Diana asked. "We can provide security guidance and emergency response protocols," Agent Reeves said. "In extreme circumstances, we can arrange temporary relocation or protective custody, but the best protection is usually completing the investigation as quickly as possible and removing the threat through arrests and prosecutions." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Diana providing detailed information about every aspect of Victoria's operation that she'd uncovered. The agents were particularly interested in the technical aspects of how the fraudulent transactions had been concealed, and they asked specific questions about David Kim's role in the scheme. By the time Diana left the FBI office, she felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Relieved because her allegations were being taken seriously by law enforcement professionals, with the resources and authority to hold Victoria accountable. Terrified because she now understood that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than simple corporate fraud. The ride home through downtown Seattle felt different, as if she was seeing the city through new eyes. Every black sedan looked suspicious. Every stranger who made eye contact seemed potentially threatening. Diana realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by her decision to investigate Victoria's activities, and there was no going back to the comfortable anonymity she'd enjoyed before. But as she parked outside her apartment building and walked through the familiar lobby, Diana also felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. For the first time since being fired from Morrison Associates, she wasn't fighting alone. The FBI had resources and experience that could match Victoria's sophistication, and their investigation would likely expose criminal activities that went far beyond what Diana had discovered. The question now was whether Victoria would recognize that her operation was compromised and attempt to flee, or whether she would escalate her campaign against Diana and anyone else who threatened her enterprise. Either way, Diana suspected that the final confrontation was approaching rapidly. That evening, Marcus called with news that confirmed Diana's suspicions. Victoria had called another emergency team meeting, this time specifically addressing rumors and misinformation that were allegedly being spread about the firm's operations. She'd announced that Morrison Associates was implementing new security protocols to protect client information and staff privacy. "She looked scared," Marcus said, "like genuinely frightened for the first time since I've known her. And David Kim wasn't at the meeting, which is unusual because he normally handles any discussions about security protocols." The absence of David Kim suggested that the FBI's investigation was already having an impact. If he was Victoria's technical accomplice, then his sudden unavailability indicated that law enforcement might have already moved against him. "Did Victoria say anything specific about the investigation?" Diana asked. "She didn't mention it directly," Marcus replied, "but she did say that certain former employees were making false allegations in an attempt to damage the firm's reputation, and that current employees should be prepared to defend the company's integrity if contacted by outside parties." The language was carefully chosen to sound like standard corporate crisis management, but Diana recognized it as preparation for the FBI interviews that would inevitably follow. Victoria was coaching her staff to present a united front against what she would characterize as unfounded attacks on the firm's reputation. But Diana also heard something else in Victoria's message: desperation. The confident, authoritative manager who had fired Diana for insubordination was gone, replaced by someone who was scrambling to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. The final pieces of the puzzle came together over the next 48 hours. Jennifer Walsh called to confirm that she would cooperate with the FBI investigation, providing independent verification of the fraudulent transactions Diana had identified. 2 additional Morrison Associates employees reached out through encrypted channels, offering their own evidence of irregularities they'd noticed but had been afraid to report. And then, on a Thursday morning that started like any other, Diana received a call that changed everything. "This is Agent Reeves," the voice said. "We've executed search warrants at Morrison Associates and arrested Victoria Hartwell and David Kim on charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. We need you to come in for a follow-up interview this afternoon." Diana hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. After months of investigation and harassment, after weeks of fear and uncertainty, the moment she'd been working toward had finally arrived. Victoria Hartwell was in custody, her criminal operation was exposed, and the clients who had been victimized would finally have justice. But even as relief flooded through her, Diana knew that the real work was just beginning. The FBI's investigation would likely reveal additional victims and accomplices, the stolen money would need to be recovered and returned, and Diana would probably spend months providing testimony and evidence for the prosecution. Most importantly, she would need to rebuild her own life and career from the foundation of integrity that had motivated her to speak up in the first place. The woman who had been fired for insubordination was gone, replaced by someone who understood that doing the right thing sometimes requires risking everything you thought you valued. Diana looked out her kitchen window at the Seattle skyline, the same view she'd contemplated on the day she was fired. The city looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. She was no longer a victim of Victoria's manipulation. She was a survivor who had helped expose a criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond anything she'd initially imagined. And for the first time in months, Diana felt like she could finally breathe freely. The news of Victoria Hartwell's arrest spread through Seattle's financial community like wildfire. By the time Diana arrived at the FBI field office for her follow-up interview, her phone was buzzing with calls from former colleagues, reporters, and headhunters who had suddenly remembered her name. She turned the phone off and slipped it into her purse, focusing instead on the task ahead. Special Agent Reeves greeted her with something that might have been a smile. The conference room where they met was larger than the one used for Diana's initial interview, and it was populated by a small army of federal investigators, forensic accountants, and legal specialists who were methodically dismantling Victoria's criminal enterprise. "The search of Morrison and Associates yielded more evidence than we anticipated," Agent Reeves began, gesturing towards several boxes of documents and computer equipment. "We've identified at least 47 client accounts that show irregular activity consistent with the patterns you documented. The total amount of stolen funds appears to exceed $4 million. $4 million. Diana felt the number like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Each dollar represented trust that had been violated, financial security that had been stolen, dreams that had been derailed by someone who was supposed to protect her client's interests. "David Kim has been cooperating with our investigation," Agent Reeves continued. "His technical expertise was crucial to Victoria's operation, but he wasn't the architect of the scheme. According to his statement, Victoria recruited him about 2 years ago with promises of financial compensation and threats about what would happen if he refused to participate." The revelation painted a picture of Victoria that was even more disturbing than Diana had imagined. She hadn't just stolen from clients, she'd systematically corrupted other employees, turning them into accomplices through a combination of bribery and intimidation. Diana wondered how many other people at Morrison Associates had been coerced into participating in activities they knew were wrong. "We're also investigating the firm's senior management," Agent Reeves said. "It's possible that Victoria's activities were known or suspected by people in positions of authority who chose to look the other way. If that's the case, they could face charges as accessories or conspirators." Diana thought about her former colleagues, who were still working at Morrison Associates, going through their daily routine while federal agents combed through their files and computer systems. The firm's reputation would be permanently damaged by the scandal, and many innocent employees would likely lose their jobs through no fault of their own. But Diana also felt a surge of vindication. For months, she'd been told that her concerns were misplaced, that she was overreacting to routine business activities, that she didn't understand the complexities of high-level financial management.
Now, federal investigators were confirming not only that her suspicions had been correct, but that the scope of the criminal activity exceeded even her most pessimistic assumptions. "What happens next?" Diana asked. "Victoria and David Kim will face federal charges that could result in significant prison sentences," Agent Reeves replied. "The stolen funds will be recovered to the extent possible and returned to the affected clients. Morrison Associates will likely face civil lawsuits and regulatory sanctions that could force them out of business." The collapse of Morrison Associates felt surreal to Diana. She'd spent 3 years building her career at the firm, forming professional relationships and contributing to what she'd believed was legitimate financial work. Now, that institution was being dismantled by federal investigators who were treating it as a criminal organization. "We'll need you to testify at the trials," Agent Reeves said. "Your documentation and testimony will be crucial evidence for the prosecution. Are you prepared for that level of involvement?" Diana nodded without hesitation. After everything Victoria had put her through, the wrongful termination, the character assassination, the systematic harassment, she was more than ready to tell her story in open court, where Victoria would be forced to listen and unable to retaliate. The FBI interview lasted most of the afternoon, with Diana providing detailed explanations of her investigative process and the significance of various pieces of evidence she'd gathered. By the time she left the federal building, the sun was setting over Elliott Bay, and Diana felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of completion. Her phone showed 37 missed calls and 83 unread text messages. News of the FBI raid on Morrison Associates had been reported by local business media, and Diana's name was mentioned in several articles as a key witness in the investigation. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also validating in a way she hadn't expected. For months, Victoria had tried to paint Diana as a disgruntled employee making false allegations to settle personal grievances. Now, federal law enforcement was publicly confirming that Diana's concerns had been legitimate and that her investigation had helped expose serious criminal activity. The narrative Victoria had tried to construct was crumbling under the weight of objective evidence. Diana drove home through the familiar streets of Capitol Hill, past the coffee shops and bookstores and restaurants that had provided comfort during the most difficult months of her life. Everything looked the same, but she felt fundamentally different. The woman who had been fired for insubordination was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and refused to be intimidated by people who abused their positions of power. Her apartment felt smaller than usual, as if the walls couldn't quite contain the magnitude of what had happened. Diana opened her laptop and began typing an email to Marcus and Jennifer, thanking them for their courage in speaking up and letting them know that their evidence had been crucial to the FBI's case. As she wrote, Diana found herself thinking about all the Morrison Associates employees who had noticed irregularities but had chosen to remain silent rather than risk their careers. She didn't blame them. The pressure to conform and the fear of retaliation were real and rational responses to an impossible situation. But she also knew that their silence had allowed Victoria's operation to continue for far longer than it should have. The next morning brought a call from Sarah Martinez. Her voice was warm with satisfaction as she delivered news that Diana hadn't expected. "I just got off the phone with 3 different accounting firms," Sarah said. "They're all asking if you'd be interested in interviewing for senior positions. Apparently, word has gotten out about your role in exposing the Morrison Associates fraud, and people are impressed with your integrity and investigative skills." Diana sat down heavily on her couch, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her professional prospects. For months, she'd been struggling to find decent employment, while Victoria's associates spread rumors about her mental stability and reliability. Now, the same industry that had shunned her was actively recruiting her. "I'm not ready to think about new positions yet," Diana said. "The legal proceedings are going to take months, and I want to see this through to the end." "Of course," Sarah replied, "but it's good to know that you have options. And Diana, I'm proud of you. What you did took real courage." After Sarah hung up, Diana sat in her living room and thought about courage. She'd never considered herself particularly brave, quite the opposite, actually. She'd always been the careful one, the rule follower, the person who avoided conflict and tried to maintain professional relationships even when they were uncomfortable.
But somewhere during her investigation of Victoria's activities, Diana had discovered that courage wasn't about being fearless. Courage was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. It was about choosing integrity over security, truth over comfort, justice over personal convenience. The media attention intensified over the following days. The Seattle Times ran a front-page article about the Morrison Associates scandal, with Diana's role prominently featured. The article described her as a whistleblower whose diligent investigation helped federal authorities uncover a sophisticated money laundering operation that had stolen millions from unsuspecting clients. Reading about herself in such terms felt surreal. Diana had never set out to be a whistleblower or a hero. She'd simply been trying to protect clients who were being victimized by someone they trusted. But she was beginning to understand that heroism often emerged from ordinary people making difficult choices in extraordinary circumstances. The validation was gratifying, but it also brought unwanted attention. Reporters called requesting interviews, strangers recognized her on the street, and her social media profiles were flooded with messages from people praising her courage or criticizing her for betraying her former employer. Diana found herself thinking about Victoria, sitting in a federal detention center and contemplating the collapse of everything she'd built through years of criminal activity. Part of Diana felt satisfaction at Victoria's downfall, justice for the clients who had been robbed, and vindication for everyone Victoria had intimidated or silenced. But another part of Diana felt something closer to pity. Victoria had possessed genuine talent and intelligence that she could have used to build a legitimate career and make positive contributions to her profession. Instead, she'd chosen to exploit her position for personal gain, ultimately destroying not only her own future, but the futures of everyone who had trusted her. The preliminary hearing for Victoria's case was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. Diana arrived at the federal courthouse early, wearing the same navy blue suit she'd worn to her first meeting with David Chen. The symbolism felt appropriate. She was the same person who had walked out of Morrison Associates with a cardboard box of personal belongings, but she was also fundamentally transformed by everything that had happened since. The courthouse was an imposing building of gray stone and tall windows, designed to project authority and permanence. Diana passed through security and found her way to the appropriate courtroom, where she was scheduled to provide preliminary testimony about her investigation and the evidence she'd gathered. Victoria was already seated at the defendant's table when Diana entered the courtroom. She looked smaller than Diana remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of federal criminal charges. When their eyes met across the courtroom, Victoria's expression was unreadable, a mixture of anger, resignation, and something that might have been regret. Diana took her seat in the witness gallery and waited for the proceedings to begin. The courtroom gradually filled with attorneys, federal investigators, reporters, and observers who were drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. When the judge entered and called the court to order, Diana felt the gravity of the moment settling around her like a cloak. The prosecutor's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She outlined the scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise, the sophisticated methods used to conceal the theft, and the harm inflicted on dozens of innocent clients who had trusted Morrison & Associates with their financial security. The defendant exploited her position of trust to steal over $4 million from clients who relied on her professional expertise. She used sophisticated technology and accounting manipulation to hide her crimes, and when a courageous employee began asking questions, the defendant attempted to silence her through wrongful termination and character assassination. Diana felt a surge of emotion as the prosecutor described her investigation and the evidence she'd gathered. For months, she'd questioned whether she was doing the right thing, whether the personal and professional costs of speaking up were justified. Now, a federal prosecutor was describing her work as courageous and instrumental in exposing one of the most sophisticated financial fraud schemes in the region's history. When Diana was called to testify, she felt a moment of nervousness as she approached the witness stand.
Victoria was watching her intently, and Diana could feel the weight of that gaze as she raised her right hand to take the oath. But as Diana began describing her investigation, the nervousness faded and was replaced by something more powerful, the calm certainty that comes with telling the truth. She explained how she'd first noticed irregularities in the Pemberton account, how she'd documented suspicious transactions, and how Victoria had responded to her questions with increasingly aggressive attempts to silence her. Did you ever consider that you might be mistaken about the irregularities you observed? Victoria's defense attorney asked during cross-examination. Of course, Diana replied. That's why I documented everything so carefully and sought independent verification from other sources. I wanted to be absolutely certain that my concerns were legitimate before taking any action. But isn't it true that you were terminated for legitimate performance issues rather than retaliation for your allegations? Diana looked directly at Victoria as she answered. I was terminated because I discovered evidence of criminal activity and refused to be silenced. The performance issues cited in my termination were fabricated after the fact to provide cover for what was actually retaliation against a whistleblower. The cross-examination continued for another hour, with Victoria's attorney attempting to portray Diana as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against a supervisor who had legitimately disciplined her. But Diana's documentation was too thorough, her testimony too consistent, and the corroborating evidence too overwhelming for the defense strategy to succeed. When Diana stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a profound sense of completion. She had told her story clearly and completely, supported by evidence that spoke for itself. Whatever happened next in the legal proceedings, she had done everything possible to ensure that Victoria would be held accountable for her crimes. The hearing continued for several more hours, with testimony from FBI agents, forensic accountants, and other witnesses who had contributed to the investigation. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, it was clear that Victoria's defense would be challenging, given the overwhelming evidence of criminal activity. Diana left the courthouse feeling emotionally drained but professionally vindicated. The woman who had been fired for insubordination was now being praised by federal prosecutors for her integrity and investigative skills. The false narrative Victoria had tried to construct about Diana's character and motivations had been thoroughly discredited in open court. Over the following weeks, additional details of Victoria's operation emerged through court filings and media reports. The money laundering aspect of the scheme was even more extensive than initially suspected, with connections to criminal organizations operating across multiple states. Victoria hadn't just stolen from individual clients, she'd helped finance drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other serious felonies. The revelation transformed Diana's understanding of what she'd uncovered. She thought she was investigating simple embezzlement, but she'd actually stumbled onto a criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond the financial services industry. Her careful documentation and persistent questioning had helped federal authorities dismantle a significant criminal enterprise. Marcus called one evening with news that Morrison Associates was officially closing its doors. The firm's reputation had been so thoroughly damaged by the scandal that remaining clients were fleeing en masse, and regulatory authorities were revoking the licenses necessary to operate as an investment advisor. It's surreal, Marcus said. 3 years of my life, gone. But honestly, I'm relieved. I don't think I could have continued working there knowing what we know now about Victoria's activities. Diana understood his mixed emotions. The collapse of Morrison Associates meant that dozens of innocent employees were losing their jobs through no fault of their own. But it also meant that the institution that had harbored Victoria's criminal enterprise would no longer be able to victimize unsuspecting clients. Have you thought about what you want to do next? Diana asked. Actually, yes, Marcus replied. Jennifer and I have been talking about starting our own compliance consulting firm. We want to help other financial institutions implement systems that would make it harder for people like Victoria to operate undetected. The idea was both practical and inspiring. Marcus and Jennifer had seen firsthand how sophisticated criminals could exploit weaknesses in financial oversight, and they were uniquely positioned to help other firms strengthen their defenses against similar schemes. I think that's brilliant, Diana said, and if you need any help getting started, let me know. The conversation reminded Diana that she needed to think seriously about her own future. The job offers Sarah had mentioned were still coming in, but Diana was no longer interested in simply returning to her previous career path. Her experience investigating Victoria's crimes had revealed skills and interests she hadn't known she possessed. Diana spent the next several weeks researching opportunities in financial forensics and white-collar crime investigation. The work would combine her analytical skills with her newfound understanding of how financial crimes operated, and it would allow her to continue protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminals. The prospects were exciting, but Diana also knew that any future career decisions would need to wait until after Victoria's trial concluded. She had committed to seeing the legal process through to its completion, both as a matter of personal integrity and as a responsibility to the clients who had been victimized. Victoria's trial was scheduled to begin in January, nearly a year after Diana had first been fired from Morrison Associates. The intervening months had been filled with depositions, evidence reviews, and pretrial motions that had gradually built toward the ultimate confrontation between Victoria and the federal government. Diana arrived at the courthouse on the first day of trial with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She would be testifying again, this time as a key witness for the prosecution, in a case that could result in decades of prison time for Victoria and her accomplices. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and family members of the victims whose money had been stolen. Diana looked different than she had at the preliminary hearing. The confident, authoritative manager who had fired Diana for insubordination was gone, replaced by someone who appeared to have aged years in the span of months. The orange jumpsuit had been replaced by a conservative business suit, but nothing could disguise the weight of the criminal charges she faced. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and the introduction of hundreds of pieces of evidence. Diana's testimony was spread across 2 days, during which she methodically explained her investigation and the significance of each document and transaction record she'd preserved. The defense strategy focused on portraying Victoria as a scapegoat for institutional failures at Morrison Associates, someone who had been pressured by senior management to generate profits regardless of the methods used. But the strategy collapsed under the weight of evidence, showing that Victoria had personally initiated and directed the criminal activity. David Kim testified for the prosecution, providing detailed technical explanations of how Victoria's scheme had operated and how she had recruited him to participate. His testimony was particularly damaging because it demonstrated the premeditated and sophisticated nature of Victoria's criminal enterprise. On the final day of testimony, Diana found herself sitting in the gallery as the prosecutor delivered her closing argument. The prosecutor painted a picture of systematic betrayal, describing how Victoria had exploited her client's trust to finance criminal activity while destroying the lives of anyone who threatened to expose her. The defendant's crimes weren't committed in a moment of weakness or financial desperation, the prosecutor said. They were the result of calculated decisions to exploit her position for personal gain, regardless of the harm inflicted on innocent people who trusted her with their financial security. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts. Diana watched Victoria's face as the verdicts were read, seeing the final collapse of someone who had once seemed untouchable. Victoria would face decades in federal prison, and her professional reputation was permanently destroyed. But as Diana left the courthouse that afternoon, she didn't feel the satisfaction she'd expected. Justice had been served, and the clients who had been victimized would see their money returned to the extent possible. But the human cost of Victoria's crimes, the destroyed careers, the violated trust, the institutional damage, couldn't be fully repaired by any court verdict. What Diana felt instead was a sense of closure and purpose.
She had seen a wrong and had taken action to correct it, despite significant personal and professional costs. She had proven to herself and others that ordinary people could stand up to sophisticated criminals and institutional corruption when they had the courage to act on their principles. The weeks following Victoria's conviction brought a flood of media attention and job offers that Diana found both gratifying and overwhelming. The woman who had been fired for insubordination was now being celebrated as a hero of financial integrity, someone whose courage had protected innocent people from ongoing victimization. Diana accepted a position with a federal agency that investigated financial crimes, work that would allow her to continue protecting people from sophisticated criminals while using the skills she developed during her investigation of Victoria's operation. The irony wasn't lost on her. Victoria's attempt to silence her had ultimately led to a career that was more meaningful and impactful than anything Diana could have achieved at Morrison Associates. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, Diana received an unexpected phone call from Agent Reeves. The federal investigation had expanded to include other financial institutions where Victoria's criminal network had operated, and Diana's testimony had been instrumental in securing additional convictions. You should know that your investigation saved dozens of additional families from being victimized, Agent Reeves said.
The methods you documented helped us identify similar schemes at other firms, and we've recovered over $10 million in stolen funds. The number was staggering. Diana's decision to document irregularities and ask uncomfortable questions had protected far more people than she'd ever imagined. The ripple effects of her courage extended beyond Morrison Associates to impact criminal operations across multiple states and institutions. But perhaps more importantly, Diana's example had inspired other financial professionals to speak up when they noticed suspicious activities. Several had cited her case as motivation for reporting irregularities they might otherwise have ignored, creating a network effect that was making it harder for financial criminals to operate undetected. As Diana hung up the phone and returned to her work investigating securities fraud for the federal government, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. It had started with a simple observation about irregular transactions in an elderly client's account, but it had evolved into something much larger and more significant. Victoria Hartwell had tried to silence her with false accusations of insubordination, wrongful termination, and systematic character assassination. But those attacks had only strengthened Diana's resolve and highlighted the importance of her investigation. The woman Victoria had underestimated as a troublesome employee had become the architect of her downfall. Diana looked out her office window at the Seattle skyline, the same view she'd contemplated from her apartment during the darkest days of her investigation. The city looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. She was no longer the careful, rule-following analyst who had been afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. She was someone who understood that integrity sometimes required courage, that protecting innocent people was worth professional and personal risks, and that ordinary individuals could make extraordinary differences when they refused to be intimidated by those who abuse their power. The phone on Diana's desk rang, signaling another case that would require her analytical skills and investigative instincts. She picked up the receiver with confidence, ready to continue the work that had become her calling. Somewhere out there, another criminal was exploiting their position of trust to harm innocent people. They would soon discover what Victoria Hartwell had learned too late. Underestimating Diana Chen was a costly mistake that sophisticated criminals could no longer afford to make. 2 years had passed since Victoria Hartwell's conviction, and Diana Chen stood in a conference room that overlooked the federal courthouse where justice had finally been served. The irony of the location wasn't lost on her. She was now leading a team of financial investigators who specialized in exposing exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud that Victoria had perpetrated. The case files spread across the mahogany table represented 6 months of meticulous investigation into another criminal enterprise, this one operating out of Portland and targeting retirement accounts belonging to military veterans. Diana's team had traced nearly $3 million in stolen funds through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that rivaled Victoria's operation in its complexity. The pattern recognition software flagged these transactions based on the algorithms we developed from the Morrison case, said Thomas Rivera, Diana's lead forensic accountant. Without that baseline data, we might never have identified the irregularities. Diana nodded, studying the transaction records that told a story of betrayal and institutional corruption. The techniques were different, but the underlying psychology was identical. Criminals exploiting positions of trust to victimize people who had every reason to believe their financial advisors were protecting their interests. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Williams, who had indeed started the compliance consulting firm he'd envisioned. His business was thriving, providing oversight services to financial institutions that wanted to avoid becoming the next Morrison Associates. The message was brief but significant. Just landed the first national contract. They specifically requested our services because of your reputation. Diana smiled at the message. Her work investigating Victoria's crimes had created a ripple effect throughout the financial services industry, establishing new standards for detecting and preventing fraud. More importantly, it had demonstrated that ethical professionals who spoke up about wrongdoing would be supported rather than silenced. The meeting continued for another hour, with Diana's team finalizing their evidence package for federal prosecutors. The Portland case would likely result in multiple arrests and convictions, protecting thousands of veterans from ongoing theft. As Diana reviewed the final documents, she thought about the elderly clients whose money Victoria had stolen and how different their lives might have been if someone had spoken up sooner. After the meeting concluded, Diana walked to her office and found an unexpected visitor waiting in the reception area.
Jennifer Walsh sat nervously in one of the leather chairs, clutching a manila envelope and wearing an expression that Diana recognized from their conversations during the Morrison investigation. "Jennifer," Diana said warmly, "what brings you here?" "I need your advice," Jennifer replied, "about something that might be happening at my new firm." They moved to Diana's private office, where Jennifer explained that she'd noticed irregularities in client account management that reminded her of the patterns they'd uncovered at Morrison Associates. The new firm was smaller and more prestigious, with clients who included several Fortune 500 companies and high-profile individuals. "I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid," Jennifer said, "that I'm seeing problems where none exist because of what happened with Victoria, but the discrepancies are real and they're getting larger." Diana listened carefully as Jennifer described her observations, recognizing the same careful attention to detail that had made her such a valuable ally during the Morrison investigation. More importantly, Diana heard the familiar notes of fear and uncertainty that she remembered from her own early suspicions about Victoria's activities. "What does your instinct tell you?" Diana asked. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. "That someone is stealing from clients and using sophisticated methods to hide it, but also that reporting it could destroy my career if I'm wrong." The conversation transported Diana back to her own apartment 2 years earlier, when she'd sat at her dining table, surrounded by evidence of Victoria's crimes, and wondered whether speaking up was worth the professional and personal risks. She remembered the isolation, the fear, and the crushing weight of responsibility that came with possessing knowledge that could protect innocent people. "You know what I'm going to tell you," Diana said gently. Jennifer nodded. "That doing the right thing is worth the risk. That staying silent makes me complicit in whatever's happening." "Actually," Diana replied, "I'm going to tell you that you're not alone this time. That if your suspicions are correct, you have resources and support that didn't exist when I was investigating Victoria's operation." Diana spent the next 2 hours helping Jennifer organize her evidence and develop a strategy for documenting any additional irregularities she might discover. More importantly, she provided Jennifer with contacts at federal agencies and legal organizations that specialized in protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. "The landscape has changed since the Morrison case," Diana explains. "There's greater awareness of financial fraud patterns, stronger legal protections for people who report suspected crimes, and institutional support for ethical professionals who speak up about wrongdoing." As Jennifer prepared to leave, she paused at Diana's office door. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to investigate Victoria's activities. How many more people would have been victimized? How much more money would have been stolen?"
"I wasn't brave," Diana replied. "I was scared and uncertain, and convinced that I was probably wrong about everything. But I documented what I saw and asked questions when things didn't make sense. The bravery came from other people. Marcus, you, the FBI agents, the prosecutors, who supported the investigation even when it would have been easier to look the other way." After Jennifer left, Diana returned to her work on the Portland case, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation they'd had. She thought about the institutional changes that had emerged from Victoria's prosecution, the new oversight mechanisms that were making financial fraud more difficult to perpetrate and easier to detect. But she also thought about the people who were still working in financial services, going through their daily routines while potentially observing irregularities they were afraid to report. Jennifer's visit reminded Diana that her work wasn't finished, that every criminal enterprise they exposed created opportunities for new ones to emerge. The next morning brought news that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Diana received a call from the CEO of Morrison Associates' former parent company, requesting a meeting to discuss implementing the compliance protocols that Diana's team had developed. The company was rebuilding its reputation after the scandal, and they wanted Diana's expertise to ensure that nothing like Victoria's operation could happen again. "We made mistakes," the CEO said during their video conference. "We trusted the wrong people and failed to implement adequate oversight. We want to do better, and we believe your insights are essential to that process." Diana agreed to consult on the project, recognizing the symbolic importance of helping rebuild the institution where her journey had begun. The woman who had been fired for insubordination was now being asked to design the systems that would prevent future wrongdoing. But the most meaningful call came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Pemberton, the 90-year-old widow whose foundation Victoria had stolen from, reached out to thank Diana personally for recovering the money that had been taken from the scholarship fund.
Because of your courage, 12 students received scholarships this year who wouldn't have otherwise, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice strong despite her age. You gave them opportunities they never would have had if that money had remained stolen. The conversation reminded Diana why she'd chosen to investigate Victoria's activities, despite the personal and professional costs. It wasn't about corporate policy or regulatory compliance. It was about real people whose lives were affected by the decisions of those they trusted with their financial security. That evening, Diana attended a conference on financial crime prevention, where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. The audience included compliance professionals, federal investigators, and financial advisors who were working to strengthen ethical standards throughout the industry. As Diana stood at the podium, looking out at the hundreds of people who had gathered to learn about detecting and preventing financial fraud, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years earlier, she'd been a careful analyst who avoided conflict and tried to maintain professional relationships even when they made her uncomfortable. Financial fraud succeeds because it exploits trust, Diana began her speech. Criminals like Victoria Hartwell understand that most people want to believe the best about their colleagues and institutions. They count on our reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions or challenge authority figures who might be abusing their positions. She spoke about the importance of documentation, the value of independent verification, and the institutional changes that were making financial crime more difficult to perpetrate. But mostly, she spoke about courage, the ordinary courage required to speak up when something seemed wrong, even when doing so carried professional and personal risks. The most sophisticated compliance systems in the world are worthless if the people operating them are afraid to report what they observe, Diana said. Creating a culture where ethical professionals feel safe speaking up about suspected wrongdoing is the most effective fraud prevention tool we can implement. After the speech, Diana was approached by dozens of audience members who shared their own stories of observing irregularities and struggling with decisions about whether to report them. The conversations reinforced her belief that institutional change required individual courage, but that individual courage was strengthened by institutional support. The conference continued into the evening with workshops and panel discussions about emerging fraud patterns and detection techniques. Diana participated in several sessions, sharing insights from the Morrison case and learning about new challenges facing the financial services industry. But the most significant moment came during a quiet conversation with a young compliance officer who reminded Diana of herself 2 years earlier. The woman described observing suspicious activities at her firm, but feeling uncertain about whether her concerns were legitimate. "What if I'm wrong?" the woman asked. "What if I destroy my career over something that turns out to be completely innocent?" Diana looked at the young woman and saw herself standing in the Morrison Associates break room, stirring terrible coffee and wondering whether the Pemberton account irregularities were worth investigating. She remembered the fear and uncertainty, but she also remembered what had happened when she chose to act on her suspicions despite those concerns. "The question isn't whether you might be wrong," Diana replied. "The question is whether you can live with yourself if you're right and you do nothing." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Diana providing practical advice about documentation and legal protections, while also offering the kind of moral support she wished she'd had during her own investigation. When they finally parted ways, the young woman had committed to conducting her own careful investigation of the activities she'd observed. Driving home through the Seattle streets that had become so familiar during her months of unemployment and uncertainty, Diana reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since Victoria's attempt to silence her. The woman who had been fired for insubordination was now a respected federal investigator whose work was protecting thousands of innocent people from financial predators. But more importantly, Diana had discovered something about herself that she'd never known existed. When confronted with injustice, when faced with the choice between personal safety and protecting innocent people, she was capable of extraordinary courage. The careful rule follower had become someone who understood that some rules were meant to be challenged, and some authority figures deserved to be questioned. Her phone buzzed with a final message of the day, this one from David Chen, the attorney who had guided her through the legal complexities of exposing Victoria's crimes. He was forwarding a news article about Victoria's appeal being rejected by the federal court system. Victoria would serve her full sentence without the possibility of early release. Diana read the article twice, then deleted it without saving it. Victoria Hartwell was no longer the focus of her thoughts or the motivation for her work.
The criminal who had tried to destroy her reputation and silence her voice had become nothing more than a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing positions of trust. What mattered now was the work itself, the ongoing effort to protect innocent people from sophisticated criminals, the institutional changes that were making fraud more difficult to perpetrate, and the growing network of ethical professionals who were committed to speaking up when they observed wrongdoing. Diana pulled into her apartment building's parking garage and sat for a moment in the silence, thinking about tomorrow's meetings and the cases her team was investigating. Somewhere in the city, another financial criminal was probably exploiting their position to steal from unsuspecting clients. But unlike 2 years ago, that criminal would now face a financial services industry that was better equipped to detect fraud and more willing to support professionals who reported suspicious activities. The woman who had been fired for asking uncomfortable questions about client account irregularities had become the architect of systems designed to encourage and protect people who asked those same questions. Victoria Hartwell's attempt to silence her had ultimately amplified her voice throughout an entire industry. As Diana walked through her building's lobby and waited for the elevator, she thought about all the people whose money had been recovered, whose futures had been protected, and whose trust in financial institutions had been restored because she'd chosen to document what she'd observed rather than ignore it. The elevator doors opened and Diana stepped inside, ready to continue the work that had become her calling. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect innocent people from those who would exploit their trust. Victoria Hartwell had underestimated the quiet determination of a financial analyst who refused to be intimidated. That miscalculation had cost her everything and transformed Diana into something far more dangerous than Victoria had ever imagined, a federal investigator with the skills, resources, and institutional support necessary to expose even the most sophisticated financial crimes. The doors closed, and Diana rode up to her apartment, satisfied with the knowledge that justice had been served and that her work was making a difference in the lives of people she would never meet, but whose financial security she was committed to protecting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.